we are good to go.
If you're a printer and you need to produce an illustration, traditionally in the 19th century until the development of half-tone engraving, you would have commissioned a wood engraver to produce a woodcut or a wood block. But there were various processes that were delivered to make this possible in-house, up to a point, the printing equivalent of Lego, where the printer was assembling components to create various illustrations. One of the nicest examples is from the City Type Foundry, a foundry run by a man called Charles Morton, who really pinched anybody else's ideas that were likely to make money and electrotyped their types. Now, here in one of the City Type Foundry specimen books, we have their architectural typeface. This was quite ingenious, because if you wanted to reproduce an image of your head office or your foundry or your wood letter cutting works on your letterheads and your invoices, you could assemble it from the various components. I think there are around 24 or more. They include chimney pots, window frames, doors, roof tiles, all sorts of architectural elements. So you could build your office in a printer's chase and then produce an illustration without the need to involve an illustrator or an engraver. Clever idea. I've never actually seen examples of it in use, but it seems sensible enough. Whether Mr. Morton made a fortune out of it is debatable. That's one way of producing a drawing without needing an illustrator. For something like a map, the Boston Type Foundry came up with Boston Map Type. And this is a series of typographic squiggles, all sorts of different angles and curves. So if you had to produce, let's say, a map of the coast of New England, all of the elements necessary to do that are represented in Boston Map Type. Now, they're pretty simple systems, Morton's architectural types and Boston's map types. They're all on point bodies, or at least the prior equivalent to point bodies, so you could assemble them in a fairly regular pattern to produce the images that you want. There were much more complicated processes available at an earlier stage. One of them is this one. And this really is horrendous from a printing point of view. It's called Stigmatype, or Stigmatypy. It's a very large book, so I shall try to rest it on my knee for you. This is a picture of Johannes Gutenberg. It is made entirely from tiny pieces of type. Stigmatype was made in 1.5 point pieces, and at the end of each piece of type there was a dot, 6 different sizes of dot, and the printer was expected to assemble these to represent light and shade. This is a splendid example. I shudder to think how many weeks it took to actually set this. From a point of view of a jobbing printing office, it was completely impractical. But some of the examples in this book, mainly by a man called Carl Fassol, a Viennese printer in the 1860s, are quite splendid. There are bowls of fruit, there are heraldic devices, but of course this one of Gutenberg is the one that stands out. I hope you can see Gutenberg's name at the bottom of that. Stigmatypy, remarkably, won a gold medal at a trade fair in the 1860s. As I say, attractive on the printed page, in a busy printing office, almost impossible to achieve that sort of end result. Printing from type was one way of producing your illustrations. In the 1880s, the late 19th century, 1890s, there was a craze for brass rule bending. Brass rule is the standard stock item that a printer uses to produce straight lines. And this, Gutenberg again, famous chap that he is, this picture of Gutenberg is produced entirely from brass rule, bent into various shapes. There isn't a single drawn line in this illustration of Gutenberg. It's different weights of rule. I think I can see some 6-point rule, some finer, thinner examples of brass rule. But again, an enormous amount of work for an end result that could be achieved much more simply by commissioning an illustrator to produce an engraving. And this is late 19th century. It was made at a time when there were multiple options for the production of this kind of printing block. So it's a bit of a nonsense really, but as I say, the brass rule craze was an obsession. British Printer is full of examples of images made from brass rule, fancy initials, all sorts of different pictures. The crazy thing about some of the brass rule images, and there's a famous one in the January 1891 edition of British Printer, which is a lion in the jungle surrounded by leaves and grasses. The details of that particular block are that it was made from brass rule by driving it into a wooden block, but it was far too high to print. It had to be ground down, it had to be proofed, and then the image which was printed was turned into a printing block using a photomechanical process. So again, a very attractive end product, but a complete nonsense in terms of practicality. Printers have always been quite keen to show off, either with brass rule or stigmatype. This is a much later example from the 1930s, and it is King Edward VIII, the shortest reigning monarch in, I think, British history, possibly. This was done on the monotype machine by Batley Brothers around the time of Edward VIII's accession, and it is comprised entirely of monotype characters set on a monotype machine, and the size of each character dictates the appearance of light or shade. We have quite a collection of these at St Bride. There is a rather nice one done of Her Majesty the Queen around the time of her coronation in 1953, which sadly I haven't been able to put my hands on today, but this one is pretty representative of the high standard of work that was achievable on a monotype machine by a skilled operator. But these are all novelties. None of them are really very practical. Certainly there were much easier ways of producing illustrations. That sort of brings me to the end of this little snapshot of what we have in room 19. There are far more, I think treasures is perhaps too strong a word for some of these, but some very interesting pieces that are well worth investigating. So do come along to St Bride. We're open every Wednesday between 12 and 6:30 at the present time during the coronavirus pandemic. But do make an appointment. Don't just turn up on the doorstep. We're still open for business, and we're still looking forward very much to seeing you. So do drop in again very soon.